on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us for today's virtual town hall focused on education here on the ABC15 Facebook page. We are so happy to have you with us, and I am extremely excited to have our experts here with us today. I'll go ahead and introduce you to who's going to be helping address some of your questions or concerns. In the top right of your screen, you will see Marisol Garcia. She is Vice President of Arizona Education Association. Marisol, glad to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting.
In the bottom right side of your screen, we have Chris Cotterman. He is the Director of Government for the Arizona School Boards Association. And then in the bottom left of your screen, we have Janine Menard. She is with the Arizona School Counselors Association, and she is also a school counselor in the Tolleson Elementary School District. So thank you all so much for being here. Marisol, I should also mention you are a history teacher. Is that correct?
Social studies. Yes. Middle school.
Social studies teacher in middle school. All right. So we have some great insight for you today. I think these three bring some tremendous perspective as we really face the daunting task of reopening schools this upcoming school year. So as we go here, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the comment section. I'm going to be going through them so that hopefully we can address any of your questions and concerns. I want to start with one question that we saw right off the top. And guys, this is something that I think every parent out there, any family member, any caregiver is thinking. Sarah Elizabeth Miller asking, will our kids be safe? Will the staff and teachers be safe? And how is that possible when our numbers are going up every day? So, clearly we don't have the expertise to guarantee that or to weigh in as far as a, physical health perspective. But our schools are doing things to address these concerns. And so, Marisol, I want to start with you. AEA is the largest teacher membership group in the state. And so you are hearing a lot from teachers and staff. I know some of them have safety concerns. So what are you hearing from them, and what sorts of steps are you seeing districts take to try to mitigate some of those concerns?
So, I think educators across the state are nervous just as much as every Arizonan. Going to the grocery store, having a little bit of anxiety of whether or not they may contract a virus. They really had to spend a lot of their energy in the spring doing crisis learning and trying to connect with students and keep them, safe, as well as ensuring they had educational opportunities. I think where we're seeing the best conversations happen at a district level is where educator voices and parental voices are saturated in decision making. So they're able to share those concerns at a district level and also give opportunities and options and be thoughtful. If teachers have voice in this, if educators have voice in this, we're going to be able to see this be extremely successful.
Yeah, definitely so important to have those voices heard during this process. And Chris, I want to bring you in. Can you speak to how districts are going about putting these safety measures in place? We've seen the CDC guidelines, we've seen the state guidelines, but at the end of the day, this is a very hyper-local issue.
Absolutely. And I want to underscore too that keeping students safe is not a new thing for school districts. Marisol knows this as well. Janine knows this as well. Every single day, school administrators feel an acute responsibility to keep children safe. That's no different, just because we're in the realm of infectious disease now. So we're hyper aware of that. We know that parents, by and large, want their children back in school in some way. So it's our responsibility to make that happen. We're accountable to the voters and the people that fund the school district. So it varies. We saw this week that Kyrene School District put out a plan that would allow for in-person, a hybrid, or online, depending on how families feel about the environment. We know that districts are spending on things like thermometers to make sure that children can have their temperatures taken, or that districts will require parents to take their child's temperature and not send them to school if they're feverish or things like that. We want to do the best we can to protect students and staff, as well as their families at home, especially vulnerable populations. And we're going to do everything we can to abide by CDC guidelines in terms of making sure that we're doing our part to control the spread of virus, but also providing the services that our communities expect us to provide. So it'll vary, but it could take, like I said, take the form of temperatures, mask wearing by staff if they feel like they're vulnerable, not allowing congregation in large areas for lunch, shifting lunch, things like that. It depends on how many students are in the school. So that's sort of a Reader's Digest version.
Yeah, I mean, it is really a daunting task to figure out how you reopen schools. A lot of our classrooms are overcrowded already. We have some high school campuses in the Valley that have almost 4,000 students. So all of the districts really have to hone in on what's best for their community. There was another question here from Brandon Riggins-Gastineau. I apologize if I didn't say your last name correctly, but short and simple, he asked, why are schools reopening when COVID-19 cases are increasing in Arizona? And I think, Chris, you kind of touched on this. School isn't just an academic place for students. There is so much more that students get out of being in school. And Janine, I think this is where, your expertise really comes in. There's a social emotional part of this too, of students, possibly going through some trauma or some things during school closures, and the importance of having them, back in that school environment. Can you talk a little bit about some of the conversations you've been having with parents?
Yeah, so schools are, keeping students safe in schools. It's much more than just keeping doors locked and, even keeping them social distancing. So safety for students is how they feel connected to their school. Do they have a trusted adult who they can go to and talk about how they're feeling, if they're scared, if they're worried? Do they have a trusted adult in the school who will listen to them and give them correct information? So I think having a sense of connection to students is a really important part. Now, when I talk to a student through a computer, it's very difficult to establish that rapport and that connection. So, I think as a counselor, we're going to have to work really hard and be really creative on how we're going to maintain and sustain that connection with students.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Jennifer Spencer had a comment that kind of goes off of what you were just saying, talking about kids with learning disabilities or social issues, who can't really thrive in that online or homeschooling environment and need those experiences with other kids or, in the classroom to have that type of contact. Ginny, can you elaborate a little more on as far as, finding ways to be creative and to connect with these students as schools do reopen?
Yeah, so the best thing we can do is just call students. I made a lot of phone calls to parents and kids. Of course, I had office hours. I would reach out through different ways, through whether it be Facebook, Class Dojo, the phone, email. I think counselors got super creative, and we were just relentless with trying to contact and stay connected to our students the best way we know how. So parents, my message to you is please, reach out to your school counselors. We are still working. We are still trying. I know school academics is a big thing, but, your child's mental health and social emotional well-being is also super important. And, please reach out to us because we're here to help.
Yeah. And Marisol, for you as a teacher, can you talk a little bit about what your experience was like as a teacher during these closures and what you're hearing from some of your students and their families?
Well, I think that we had, there was a huge group of students who did not have access to internet or even access to any sort of learning that they were used to prior to the closure. And so there's a risk that a lot of these students who already were, disconnected from school, were even furthermore disconnected from school. So that is a huge concern that we have. The entire state is going to have to shift in its thinking of how we're going to look at what happened in the spring as far as student growth. And so as a collective, that's a discussion that educators are having. How do we ensure that we not just kind of catch up, but that we ensure that they have the skill set to re-enter some sort of structure that was really an emergency closure? I mean, this was trauma, and Janine can speak more to it, but this was trauma, not just for students and teachers, but for parents. There were a lot of parents who still were going to work, and we had students alone. We had older students, middle school students, taking care of younger kids. So I think what we need to be thoughtful of is that walking into this next school year, some of which are starting as soon as next month, that we need to think about how do we ensure that every single student, the most vulnerable student that we have, has educational opportunities, that has support, mental health supports, health supports, and that they're the ones that we are most driving our attention to and building these plans on. Those are the students that we need to be most concerned about. And that's why at a local level, parents need to be reaching out to their schools and their school districts, and educators need to be in the room helping make these decisions, because they're the ones, and Chris very clearly said it, from day one when I would welcome my students, I knew it was my responsibility to keep those students safe. And entering into this new world, that is a difficult thing for educators to do. And for, you know, I'm a mother as well, and so do I feel safe sending my 14-year-old to school next year? It's a conscious decision that I'm going to make, and I'm going to have to make as an educator. Do I feel safe doing that?
Right. And those are conversations that so many families are having right now. And, you know, Chris, as you mentioned, several districts, from what I've seen as well, pretty much any plan I've seen does include that online option where parents will have the choice, if they don't feel comfortable, that they can continue their remote learning in some capacity. However, something that we've also discussed in the past is, you know, Marisol, you just said it too. Not everyone has access to internet. Not everyone has access to tech devices. And I think these closures really brought out those disparities. And so, you know, Chris, from a school board's perspective, you know, how are districts taking that into consideration when they're coming up with some of these options for parents?
Yeah, so I want to back up real quick to just to talk about special needs for 1 second. I want to reassure everybody watching who's concerned about it that special education is a high priority in this environment. You know, you had an emergency closure last year where we had to make do with some stuff, but we're aware of our obligations under federal law to students with special needs, and you know, those students are top of mind when figuring out how to meet their needs in this environment, especially those who have intellectual disabilities and things like that, but also those who are medically fragile. And so we're trying to work through those issues as well. But to your point, your question, it's very hard to sort of understand what the issues are with technology when you live in a way that it's readily available to you, right? So we have created an environment for a long time where students get access to technology by going to school. They might not have it at home, so we provide technology at school, computer labs, more recently laptops, iPads. But if they're not one-to-one, meaning they don't have a device for every single student in the district, then they don't get to take those home. And now we're like, oh, it's not okay to come to school anymore every day. And they lose access to that technology. And so the equity issue around technology has become forefront right away. And so districts have gotten really creative about repurposing old technology. I know the Paradise Valley Unified School District, for example, collected every laptop they had available and basically reformatted it for home learning and passed them out all within basically a 2-week period. And so districts have gotten creative, but it really is true that technology modernization is an issue that's been underinvested in schools for a long time, especially those that don't have bond and override support. And that is becoming clear now because those school districts are also the ones where lower income families live a lot of the time. So it's becoming a big issue. We're trying to make do, but that's something that this has brought out for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that is going to continue to be a challenge as we navigate this, especially with you know, districts offering that option to make parents feel comfortable. There was a comment in here from Lacey Olerud. I said your last name right. If I didn't, I really apologize. But Lacey says, you know, she's ready to send her daughter back to school. She says she needs structure, socialization. You know, with those parents not wanting their kids in school, it'll be easier to distance their desks. So I feel like this is something interesting that was just brought up to me by actually the Kyrene district the other night. You know, they're launching a complete online academy. And so in their minds, they're thinking, okay, well, if some kids choose not to come to school because they want to do online, and then we have other kids coming to school, the ratios in the classrooms might kind of find a way to work themselves out a bit. I think that's the hope. But at the end of the day, you know, our classrooms are packed already. I mean, all of you can attest to that. And so, a lot of this goes into those deep issues that have been around for a long time of, funding education and resources. And, so now I feel like we're kind of at a point where we need to inject more resources, but it's going to be really tough to find ways to do that. And so I know all of you can kind of speak to this in some capacity, but why don't we start with you, Marisol, since you're up there at the top. I know districts are trying, but this is going to be really tough without some sort of funding help.
Yeah, I mean, the same issues that were existing prior to the closures are going to exist now prior to the pandemic. We had some of the highest classroom levels in the country, and we had almost 1,800 positions open for that were in need of teachers. So these are just going to be, growing exponentially, and it is very clear that economics and education are completely tied together. They are not two separate entities. In order for a lot of families to go back to work and to be able to work comfortably even from home, students need to be in a school. And more importantly, our students need access to this, education in order to move up within what they want to do with their families. So we're going to need a special session. We really need to have a discussion how we're going to fund these schools appropriately. We were already so tight on budgets that districts are having to be incredibly creative on how to figure out. When Chris said mentoring, the temperature checks, that's costs a lot of money. That's money that wasn't in their budget last year. I think we're all going to have to be fluid, and we're going to have to be put a lot of pressure on the legislature to have these discussions now, so that as schools begin to open up, they can feel completely confident that they have the appropriate educators to deliver that instruction. And more importantly, they have space to grow. So more counselors, we need more professional development, we need more technology. I mean, I spent a lot of time over the last few weeks working with educators on the Native American lands, on the tribal lands, and the disparity is shocking of what's happening to our students on the tribal lands. This has not been dealt with. We need to talk about that, and it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to get worse. I completely understand businesses need to be talked about. Unemployment insurance needs to be talked. We need to talk about police reform needs to be talked about. But right now, in order for us to open up these schools, we're going to need an assurance of funding, and we're going to need an assurance that we're going to have the appropriate resources to deliver opportunities for our students that they desperately need.
Absolutely. And Chris, Marisol talked about, districts are trying to address a lot of these issues. I know there's also some concerns as far as, the funding formula that we use, and not to get too, nitty gritty into some of the education speak here. But, kids who are in seats physically in classrooms get more funding than kids who are online. I mean, that's just the way everything's set up. And so what are you seeing as far as districts kind of trying to gauge that? Or, I know there's some real concern about districts losing a ton of funding right off the top because parents might be hesitant to send their kids.
Yeah, so the number one important thing to know about school funding is that it's based on the number of students who are enrolled in your school. And if your child doesn't show up for 10 days automatically right now, they have to be withdrawn from school, and if they're not excused. So if you just don't send your child to school after 10 days, that student becomes has to be withdrawn, and we no longer get funding for that student. And so, and in order to get a full year's worth of funding, they have to be delivered a certain amount of instruction, which is normally intended to be in the building. So if the kids aren't in school, they don't show up, and we can't meet those instructional minutes, then we lose money. So the number one thing that school districts need to do, and that translates directly to staff most of the time. If you lose money, you lose staff, because that's where the funding is. So the number one thing that we need from the legislature and the governor is predictability. We need to know what our budget's going to be, regardless of how many students show up on the first day, because that's going to dictate how many counselors we can have, how many teachers we can have, how many bus drivers we can have. And we have impressed upon them the need to pass some legislation, make some policy that says, for this year, we're going to waive some of those seat time requirements to make sure that your enrollment doesn't decline precipitously due to factors beyond your control. So that's basically it in a nutshell, but absolutely we need some help on that front.
Yeah, well, I thought you explained what is a very complex topic very eloquently, and I appreciate that because it always helps, me remember. Okay, this is how it works and what we're talking about. Something that Jet Clark brought up over here, and I think again, probably a common concern among many parents and teachers and staff and everyone involved in this is, if the numbers go up, kids get sick, will there be another shutdown? And obviously we can't speak on a state level, but I know that in my experience from looking over a lot of the plans, they are planning if there's some sort of an emergency closure or an intermittent closure, they kind of have contingency plans for that. So that is something I think if you go to your local district, you'll see that they're gauging for that. A lot of talk about masks on here and kids wearing masks and how you have kids wear masks. I haven't seen anything that is going to require students wear masks, except maybe in short periods of time getting on and off the bus. Obviously, we'll just have to see how that plays out. But Janine, I think, when parents are thinking about their kids wearing masks or, plexiglass, and I think there's a concern that this might, scare some students who are out there, especially the little ones who are just beginning their school experience, kindergarten or first graders. Again, what sorts of social emotional issues are going to have to be front of mind here when kids go back to school?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that so much stuff is up in the air. Chris and Marisol, you guys have explained it so well that districts really don't know exactly what to do yet. So as best as parents can, it is a really good idea to lay out all the different options that we're looking at. Of course, age appropriate. So kids do really well when they know what to expect. So whether we go into a hybrid model or we go into an all online model, it's really good, a good wellness check for your kid so they know what's happening. So if we were to go into school and we have our regular day and then we have to shut down and go back home, the students need to know every step of the way what is happening, why it's happening, give them age-appropriate information, empower them so that they can express their feelings, they could ask their questions, validate their feelings, let them know that all their feelings are okay. I say this all the time, you could have, two children and both of them experience this very differently, but both their feelings are okay, and both, you need to validate their feelings, and, there is no right or wrong. So kind of just going back is just kind of let the kids know what's happening.
Yeah, and I think that's such great advice and takeaways for any parents out there, teachers out there who are speaking with families, caregivers, just really emphasizing the importance of communication and being open and hearing those feelings. Caitlin Victoria brought up again, and we've kind of already touched on this, but she said, how do schools plan to protect teachers? Students aren't students without teachers. And, Marisol, in your organization, what are you hearing from educators? Because we have to remember, this isn't just about the students going back, but you need teachers who are comfortable going back to the classroom or in some form in order to open up schools. So what are you hearing as far as their feelings, their sentiments about reopening?
I think teachers reflect the general public. A lot of us are parents, a lot of us are grandparents and aunts and uncles. And so we have legitimate concerns about our health as well. And we are, in my world, I usually was exposed to 160 kids a day. So if there's in each one of their homes, if there's some level of exposure and then it's coming to a child and potentially to me, there is a concern. I think there's also a concern that I'm prepared to deliver the type of instruction that I'm going to be asked to, whether it's hybrid or smaller class sizes or a larger class size, where I'm going to have to change the way that I do my instruction. A lot of instruction is really targeted to individual students. So if we have a student that's struggling, for instance, in my history class, I want to be able to sit down with 3 or 4 of them and have a conversation, and the 3 or 4 of us have a little bit deeper time talking about the topic. That is going to be very difficult to do, to have kids sit that close and have that type of attention. So that's one concern. The other concern is that the funding for this new type of delivery of instruction and how rewarding it will be for students, especially for students who need that attention. We are really concerned about how ready we will be to be able to do that. Additionally, if we're asked to do two different types, so if I'm going to do, Monday and Tuesday in person, and then, for instance, Wednesday at home, that's two separate types of instruction. So that's a whole nother job that I'm going to be asked to do, and that's two. I think teachers, as overall, want to get to school and want to be in front of their kids. They enter this profession because they love it. I love being in front of my students. However, I also have a family, and I also have to think about the fact that in the spring, a lot of our educators were talking about working almost 80 to 90 hours a week. And the toll that that takes personally and then on your family is real. We were reaching out to parents in the evening, and students in the evening, and in the morning, and office hours, and then planning. And then, it just became a struggle with a crisis alone, where most of us were also worried about going to the grocery store and making sure our parents were okay. So this is a real concern, and we definitely, want to make sure the public knows teachers are ready to go back. But just like you, we have our same legitimate concerns about sending our own children back. How can we do a hybrid model if my son's going to be at home, but I need to be at work? How can I make sure that my son has the appropriate resources at home? And even more importantly, that my students have the appropriate resources at home. I was used to having to buy a lot of the resources myself. Now I'm going to, however, my students each get their own resources personally so that they don't share, because that's a transmitter as well. So these are, things we're constantly talking about and really want to make sure parents are talking to us about.
Yeah. There's just so much that goes into this. And Marisol, as you were talking about, that balance as a parent and an educator, my kids are little, they're not even in school. And the balance of trying to, work and just keep them from hurting themselves was more than enough that I could handle. But, kind of taking it onto a little bit of a more serious note, Janine, you and I spoke the other day at length about what's called trauma-sensitive teaching. And, I know that's something that was included in the Arizona Department of Education state guidelines as something that teachers and school leaders really needed to be talking about implementing for this next school year. Can you just touch on kind of what that is and why that will be so important going into this upcoming school year?
Yeah, so trauma-sensitive schools is like a mindset. So what a school will do is give professional development to all their staff. And the way the staff approaches a student, especially when it's a negative behavior, is through a trauma-informed lens. So, so basically, if a student is really angry, instead of coming at them with an angry tone and an angry body language, you would kind of learn to diffuse it a little bit. So, you look at each student with a lens of compassion and caring. Not that teachers don't already do that, but it's a ongoing professional development, constant training for teachers to be a trauma-informed school.
Yeah, and when you hear trauma, I think people may not realize that during school closures that students likely or may have, I don't want to say likely because we can't, we don't want to generalize too much, but that there is trauma that has been occurring during these school closures and when they are away from school. And Janine, if you just want to elaborate, I know we talked about unemployment, in the home, and just some of the trauma that students may be experiencing during some of these school closures and just with the pandemic and everything happening right now.
Yeah. So, parents, I'm a parent. I have two 12-year-old girls. Social media is huge. They see everything on social media. They're on TikTok. They're on YouTube. They're on Snapchat. They are seeing and hearing everything. So please, develop some kind of language and communication with them so that you can ask them questions without judgment, validating their feelings, letting them know, all feelings are okay. It could be trauma because they have a family member who is sick. They could have trauma because their family is going through something. And even if your family really isn't being directly affected by this, they can have trauma, just secondary trauma, just listening to it over and over and over again in social media. So please, be open, talk to your child. I know you guys do. I mean, I'm a parent. We check in all the time. So yeah, what's happening, it could be very traumatizing to a kid.
Yeah. And for those of you out there on Facebook, I know we're almost a half hour in. Thank you so much for joining us. For our virtual town hall focused on education, we invite you to share some of your comments or questions. We did address this a little earlier, but it's coming up quite a bit. And so I just want us to recircle on it one more time. A lot of comments as far as kids with disabilities, special education, very specific concerns regarding their own children and their situation. Chris, can you just touch back one more time on, this is certainly something that is front and center for school districts right now.
Yeah, so those parents with students with special needs are intimately familiar with the requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and special education. It's federally required that we meet their needs. We had a very specific situation at the end of school last year where the federal government relaxed some of those requirements because it was an emergency. But we are, as districts, planning to be able to find ways to meet the needs of students, whether that's only bringing special ed kids to campus periodically to make sure that they get what they need. Districts are obligated under federal law to meet those needs one way or another. Again, those parents who are familiar know that either the district does its job or they end up in front of a hearing officer to make sure that they do their job. So we take our obligations to special needs kids very seriously. And so you might see, more frequent bus runs to get students with special needs to campus and make sure that they can have their needs met. Medically fragile kids are a little bit different. If your student is very physically disabled or has a medical condition that makes it very important for them to be cautious about the virus, maybe there's different precautions that need to be taken or different arrangements that need to be made. But we are very acutely aware of the needs of special education students, and a lot of time and energy is going into plans to make sure that those students are taken care of.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that we've hit that point a couple times because, a lot of parents on here are saying, that they're concerned, they are worried, they want the best for their kids. And we just want to make sure they know that, special ed kids, this is being taken into consideration very heavily by the folks who are charged with making these decisions. Amber Lynn had just kind of a simple comment. She said, why not split the day, half online, half in school? And, that is something that we're seeing as potential options. Chris, if you just kind of want to weigh in, I know we kind of touched on this a little earlier, but I think it's helpful for people to understand this is very local, depending on what that district needs. So, if you have elementary schools with 600 or 700 students on campus, but another district has high schools with 3,000 or 4,000, those plans are going to be different.
Absolutely. So think about it like this. If you are in rural Arizona and your district covers over 1,000 square miles and you're busing students, an hour each way to come to school, you're likely not splitting the day. You're likely bringing them to campus to do a lot of stuff and then sending them home. You might do that a couple of days a week in an alternating schedule. Whereas if you're an urban district, you may have the capacity to run students on 20-minute bus rides or less home in the middle of the day. Probably the more likely scenarios is to alternate days, so you have fewer students on campus at one time rather than do half and half. But yeah, every district has to take into account its own resources, the needs and desires of its own community, and things like limiting factors like geography and availability of technology at home, things like that, to make sure that students are receiving the instruction. So if you haven't already reached out to your local governing board, do it today, because they're the 3 or 5 people that are making the decisions along with the superintendents to put these plans in motion.
Yeah, I spoke with the Rural Schools Association the other day, and he said actually a lot of their schools are already on 4-day weeks, and so how do they take into account extra bus runs and extra resources? And the Cartwright district announced a couple weeks ago they're going to a 4-day week so they can clean on the 5th day, and Alhambra's going to a 2-1-2 model. So I think it's good to look at what other districts are doing, but you also have to remember it's your specific district that's going to ultimately make that decision. We talked about resources earlier. Marisol, you mentioned if we can temperature check, that's going to require thermometers, and nurses and school counselors are going to be needed. And I'm seeing a lot of comments on the side here about nurses, about school counselors specifically. And, last year we did a lot of coverage on the budget situation, schools needing bonds and overrides in order to hopefully add more resources to their districts. Janine, I know our counselor to student ratio here in Arizona is the worst in the nation, I believe, last I had checked. It's 900 something to 1, which is well over the recommended, but certainly, a huge ratio. How do you keep track of all your students? How are you connecting with them when you have that many, and then add in this need for more connection and more attention?
Yeah, it's constant. I'm constantly available. I'm constantly in the cafeteria. I'm in the classrooms. It's a lot. But we're doing the best we can. When we went to the online model, I feel like I was traumatized. Like, I feel like I needed a counselor for like a week or two. Thank God for my counseling team in my district. They're fantastic at the Tolleson Elementary School District. So we're just constantly trying to find different ways of connecting with students. It's a lot. My district, we are so lucky. We were awarded 4 more counselors through the safety grant. So we will be, I will be having another counselor with me next year. So I'm really excited. I can't wait to get started and start building our program. But yeah, my association, we're continuously pushing for more counselors. We were hoping to get more money for more money for the safety grant. It didn't happen this year. We're going to continue to advocate and push to get our ratios down. We're also pushing, also once you have a school counselor, now you need to give them professional development. Now you need to mentor them. You can't just throw them in a school and say, okay, go and, fix all these kids. So the Arizona School Counselors Association, we're constantly advocating for professional development and mentorship, and and then of course there's pay, which I'm not going to get into, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah. And, again, not to get too political here, but, when we talk about, that was great that they were able to give some of those safety grants for, social workers or counselors or SROs for schools that requested them. As far as the teacher front, Marisol, what sorts of conversations need to happen? What needs to happen going forward to make sure we can keep more teachers coming in and meet that need? Because I know, the state talks about, teachers are expert differentiators. And when the students come in, they'll be able to figure out where each one is at and deliver them instruction based on what they need. But when you're talking about, 20, 30 kids, that is a lot for one teacher to do. So what sorts of conversations need to happen? What needs to happen to get teachers the support they'll need to do this next school year?
Yeah, I think what I saw when we went to emergency crisis learning was finally a real conversation about what's happening in the classroom. Parents kind of understanding, wow, this is what happens. This is how my student behaves, or even more so, how am I balancing all these different subjects and expectations and assessments? And they want me to work on these projects. And parents were really seeing what it felt like to be even with 1 or 2 students. So if you multiply that, again, some of the highest class sizes in the country, 30, sometimes 40. My largest class that I had in middle school was 38, times that by 6, because I taught 6 sections of it. I'm in charge of 160 students. In total, their grading, their communication with parents, making sure that they're showing growth, making sure I'm hitting all the standards, that I'm doing everything my district wants to, implementing new curriculum. Like, it just is never ending. And so the conversations need to be is, parents, remember how, you were able to get a little bit of a peek into what it was like being with students, and really needing them to put pressure on legislators to have a real conversation about no longer being 49th in the country as far as teacher pay. The turnover is crazy, and in that alone impacts students. When you have a student teacher that teaches at a site for 2 years, 3 years, and then leaves the profession, you leave a deep cut in that school community. What I found so great about working in the same district for 13 years was that my students had younger brothers and sisters, and they knew Miss Garcia, and their cousins knew Miss Garcia, and they knew that they could come to me, and I became a base of that family. And even more now, if I've been away from them for 10 years, I still get students sending me messages as I need help, or where can you direct me, or how can I be, I need help with a job. Do you know of any? So the retention is another piece. It's a massive issue that the state is going to have to look at and reprioritize and really think of new funding streams that can help support that, as well as continue with the current work. So, there are ways that we can do that, and we are definitely, the union is trying to do that, and we just need parent support. We really do. And imagine having the most professional educator who can do all the things you said: differentiate, reach out to families, support counselors, make sure that counselors are able to come in and out of rooms and be the center of the community that schools were meant to be, and still have the different priorities that Arizonans truly believe in. But I know, as an Arizona parent, the number one priority for me is my son. And I know that's true for every parent in this state. So we need to make our kids the priority.
And just a couple more points to make. This has been fantastic. I so appreciate all of the engagement from our viewers out there on Facebook, and all of your insights as well in these topics. I'm seeing a lot of people commenting on, I don't want to put my child's well-being in jeopardy just because people want to reopen schools. And I think that's where we have to remember that, again, most districts, actually all districts I've seen so far, are taking that into account in their reopening plans and drafts by providing that online option for people who don't feel comfortable sending their kids back to school. Chris, I think it's important that people understand, though, that as districts and these boards are making these decisions, it's not final. It's not the end all be all. This is going to be a fluid situation for a while. Is that what you're hearing?
Yes. So it's important to note that three things are possible. Governing boards retain the power. If they don't feel that their schools are safe to operate, they do not have to operate them. That, as we talked about earlier, that can come with some funding repercussions. But if we have policy in place that allows, alternate ways of calculating funding, that's not as much of a concern. The local health department can order schools closed. The governor can order schools closed. All those things are true. And I think that one thing that we haven't talked about yet that I think is very important is that schools, just like everybody else, need information to make decisions. So we haven't yet seen the support from the state on statewide tracking and tracing of cases. It's a very different, it's different to know that cases are trending upwards in Arizona versus cases are trending upwards in your community and you have spread in your school community, right? If you know and are able to calculate where your students have been, who they've been in contact with, or not been in contact with, then it's much easier to keep your students and staff safe. And I think that's one thing. If there's a state policy that's missing in all this, it's that one. And we are looking forward to hopefully the Department of Health Services addressing that. But information is key in this area, and school districts and governing boards and superintendents need to have the information to make the decisions. But yes, they can change course at any time throughout the year if the situation dictates it.
And you said the importance of information, not just from the state level, but I know all the districts have sent out some sort of parent survey, teacher survey, student survey, and the importance of families being involved in that and sharing their opinions and bringing their thoughts and concerns to the table. Well, this has really been fantastic. I cannot thank you all enough for joining me. I want to give each of you, kind of one final opportunity just to share anything that maybe we didn't discuss that you think is important before we go. Marisol, I'll go ahead and start with you.
I guess I just want to reiterate to everyone out there, this is a time for parents and teachers to come together and make some really important decisions for our students. It's important that our kids are safe, that teachers are safe, that educators are safe, our cafeteria workers, our health aides, that everyone feels safe at work. And more importantly, we really need to have a statewide discussion about how we're funding schools, because situations like this are going to continue to happen, and we need to be prepared for them. Our kids deserve that opportunity, and I'm really, really hopeful that we're going to go down that track.
Chris, I'll go ahead and let you take the floor one last time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I just want to underscore that if anything good has come out of this pandemic, I think it's that people who hadn't quite thought about it before are really starting to understand the critical role that public schools play in the center of our communities. from feeding students to providing parents respite from having to spend 24/7 with their kids. The ability to use public school to perform a variety of community functions, from hosting sport events to all kinds of other things, that all the things that we're not doing right now has been readily apparent. And I hope that what comes out of this is that members of society, whether they have kids or not, really begin taking a look at their support for public education and making sure that we can have these assets available for children forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know, obviously there's always more work to be done, but I think I personally was pretty amazed at how quickly the districts were able to turn around, switch gears to their, nutrition programs and their providing meals for families. I mean, not an easy task, but the fact that they were able to continue those vital services for so many in the community was really great to see. And Janine, I know, as a school counselor and member of the School Counselors Association, you and your colleagues have certainly been providing those needs as well. Anything else that you want to add that maybe we didn't touch on?
Yeah, so I have two things really quick. First of all, to all the parents, there's never going to be the best option for everybody. It's not going to be perfect. You always have somebody who it's not going to work for. So just know that districts are working really hard, and all we ever do is think about the students and the parents. So for my district, I sit on the task force that we're working on what model we're going to go back to. And I know we have a parent survey that we've been sending out. I'm assuming other districts have done it as well. So please check your email. And if you receive a survey from your school district, please fill it out. When we get your feedback, it's so much easier for us to make a decision when we have an 80% response rate from parents. 80% of the parents want this model. That's great, because we can take that model and now we can really start to build around that. So again, please reach out to your district, let them know what is going to work for you, and then we'll do our best to accommodate that.
Yeah, 100%. And just, encouraging those conversations, that communication, not just, between parents and teachers, but also, Chris mentioned the importance of reaching out to your local governing board, knowing who's making these decisions, and just keeping those conversations going so that everyone's in the know as much as possible and feels as confident as they can when they make that decision of what they're going to do, whether they send their kids in person next school year, choose the remote learning option, whatever they decide is best for them. So again, I cannot thank you all enough. Marisol, Chris, Janine, this was so insightful, fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today. And for all of you on Facebook who commented, thank you so much for being interested, for being engaged. This will actually post to abc15.com/townhall. So if for some reason you jumped in at a certain time and you're wondering what we've been talking about for 48 minutes, you can, jump over there and get a nice recap of everything we discussed today. So let's keep the conversation going. We will always do our best to bring you the most updated, most accurate, and most comprehensive information, because we know a lot of you are thinking about this particular issue quite a bit right now. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you later.